The dust was the first thing she noticed, a fine red powder that settled on the hem of her dress and clung to the air she breathed. It tasted of grit and distance. And Wei stood beside the lone stagecoach track, a small carpet bag at her feet, and watched the vehicle that had brought her to Redemption Flats, Wyoming, shrink into the shimmering summer heat. The driver had pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "Blackwood's place is a mile that way." If he's still looking, then he'd cracked his whip and left her in a world of raw sunlight and silence. Her dress, the color of a pale sunrise, was a foolish choice. She knew it the moment she'd stepped down into the dirt. It was the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with grief or travel, a remnant of a life that felt a century old instead of a mere 6 months gone. She clutched the handle of her bag, the worn leather a familiar anchor. Inside, a small, heavy pouch of coins was all that separated her from utter destitution. A man on horseback crested the low rise ahead. He rode not with the easy lope of a man enjoying the day, but with a tension in his shoulders that spoke of burdens. As he drew closer, she saw a face weathered by sun and worry, a strong jaw dusted with dark stubble, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He pulled his horse to a halt a few yards away, his gaze taking in her slight frame and her out-of-place dress with a skepticism that needed no words. This had to be him. Silas Blackwood. The advertisement in the Cheyenne paper had been stark: cook wanted. Blackwood Ranch. Must be willing to work. No drunks. You lost. His voice was a low rumble, rough as the land around them. And Wei's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. She had rehearsed a dozen different openings, but they all fled her mind now, leaving only the raw, desperate truth. She took a small step forward, her shoes sinking into the soft dust. "Are you Mr. Blackwood?" He gave a curt nod, his eyes narrowing. "I am. And I'm guessing you're not who I was expecting for the cook's job." He looked past her as if searching for a husband or a brother, someone who made sense in this landscape. She swallowed, the dust in her throat making it hard to speak. "The agency in Cheyenne sent me. My name isn't Wei." He let out a short, humorless breath. He looked tired, bone-tired. The agency sent her for woman in a pink dress? To cook for 20 ranch hands on the edge of nowhere. He shook his head, a gesture of weary disbelief rather than outright dismissal. "With all due respect, this is a mistake. This is hard country. The work is harder. I need someone who can handle it." Behind him, 2 more riders appeared, their faces curious and smudged with dirt. They reined in, their expressions a mixture of surprise and amusement. And Wei felt their eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She was a curiosity, a fragile piece of porcelain set down in a blacksmith shop. The shame was a hot flush on her cheeks, but desperation was a colder, sharper thing. She couldn't go back. There was nothing to go back to. She looked directly at Silas Blackwood, ignoring the other men. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, yet it carried in the still air. "No one loves a Chinese girl, sir." The admission was a plain, hard fact, a stone she'd been carrying for so long it felt a part of her. She let the weight of it settle between them. "But I can cook." The 2 hands exchanged a look. One of them let out a low chuckle, which he quickly stifled when Silas shot him a glare. The silence stretched, thick with heat and expectation. And Wei held his gaze, her own dark eyes refusing to waver. She had offered him the unvarnished core of her situation. She was unwanted, but she was useful. It was the only bargain she had to offer. Silas studied her for a long moment. He saw the tremor in her hands, clasped tightly on her bag. He saw the exhaustion behind the defiance in her eyes. But he also saw a spine made of something stronger than bone. He'd seen that look before, in homesteaders staring down a drought, in men who'd lost everything but the will to keep standing. He was a man drowning in work, with a crew threatening to quit over burnt biscuits and greasy bacon. He was desperate, too. He finally broke the silence, his reply cutting through the air with the force of a slammed door. "I don't care who loves you." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "I care if you can feed 20 men without poisoning them or burning the beans." The last fellow managed both. The two hands stared, their mouths slightly agape. They had expected a curt dismissal, a gruff order for her to start the long walk back to town. They had not expected this. Silas dismounted, his boots thudding softly in the dust. He stood nearly a foot taller than her, a mountain of a man in denim and worn leather. The job pays $30 a month and board. You cook 3 meals a day. You keep the cookhouse clean. You start at dawn and you finish when the work is done. You get Sundays to yourself. If the food's no good, you're gone. If you cause trouble, you're gone. He looked her square in the eye. That sound fair to you? A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over and way. She gave a single, sharp nod. Yes, sir. It's fair. All right then, he turned to one of the other men. Jed, take her bag. Get her settled in the old foreman's cabin. It's small, but it's dry. He looked back at Way. The kitchen's yours. Supper's in 4 hours. Don't be late. Without another word, he swung back onto his horse and galloped toward a cluster of low-slung buildings in the distance, leaving Way standing with the stunned ranch hand. The man named Jed, older and with a kinder face than his companion, dismounted and hesitantly took her bag. It was heavier than he expected. Welcome to the Blackwood Ranch, I suppose, Jed muttered, still looking a little dazed. Name's Jed. The handsome one is Pete. Pete just grunted from his horse. Don't mind the boss. His bark is, well, it's about as bad as his bite. Way followed Jed toward the ranch, her small figure dwarfed by the vast, empty landscape. The sunrise-colored dress seemed to glow against the brown earth. She did not yet know that the rancher's reply was not an act of kindness, but of sheer, grinding necessity. And she could not know that her quiet presence was about to disrupt the harsh rhythms of his life, and the delicate balance of power in the town of Redemption Flats, in ways neither of them could ever have imagined. The foreman's cabin was little more than a shed with a cot, a small table, and a single window facing east. But it had a sturdy door with a lock, and it was clean. Jed set her bag down with an awkward politeness. Cookhouse is that long building there. Got all the supplies you should need for a few days. Boss goes into town for stock on Saturdays. Thank you, she said quietly. Jed lingered at the door. Look, the men, they ain't used to, well, they're a rough bunch. Just keep your head down and the coffee hot, and you'll be fine. She understood the warning. She was an outsider in every way a person could be. Her race, her gender, her presence here was a disruption. She nodded. I understand. When he left, she closed the door and leaned against it, her eyes shut. She had a place. For now. It was enough. After a moment, she opened her bag, unpacked her few belongings, and changed into a simple, dark brown work dress. She tied her long black hair back severely, then walked out of the cabin and toward the cookhouse, her steps deliberate. The fight was not over, it had just begun. The cookhouse was a disaster. The previous cook had left in a hurry, and it showed. A slick of old grease coated the massive iron stove. Dirty pots were piled in a basin of murky water. A sack of flour had a hole gnawed in it by mice. For a moment, her heart sank. This was not a kitchen, it was a battlefield, and she had been left to clean up after a rout. But then, a strange sense of calm settled over her. This, she understood. Dirt could be scrubbed. Mess could be ordered. This was work for her hands, a problem she could solve. For the next 4 hours, she worked with a focused intensity that would have stunned Silas Blackwood had he seen it. She hauled water, scrubbed the stove until the iron gleamed, scoured pots until they shone, and swept the floor clean. She found the pantry and took inventory. The staples were there: beans, bacon, flour, coffee, potatoes, onions. But tucked away on a high shelf, forgotten, she found a small tin of cinnamon and a jar of dried apples. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, the cookhouse was transformed. The air smelled not of old grease, but of baking bread and simmering beef stew. She had found a side of beef in the cooler and, using a cleaver with surprising skill, had broken it down, stewing the tougher cuts with onions and potatoes, and saving the better steaks for another day. She made pan-fried potatoes instead of boiled, and the bread was light and soft. The men filed in, their faces grimy, their bodies slumped with fatigue. They moved with the caution of men expecting another disappointment. They filled their plates in silence, took their seats at the long trestle tables, and took their first bites. A quiet fell over the room. It was not the sullen silence of previous nights. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The stew was rich and savory, the meat tender. The potatoes were crisp. The bread was a revelation. Pete, the younger, more cynical hand, was the first to break. He looked down at his empty plate as if he couldn't believe it was gone, then looked over at Wei, who was quietly wiping down a counter. He said, his voice uncharacteristically respectful. That was the best meal I've had in a year." A murmur of agreement went through the room. Jed smiled into his coffee cup. Silas, who had taken his plate at the head of the table, said nothing. He simply ate, his expression unreadable. But when he was finished, he stood, took his plate to the wash basin, and paused beside her on his way out. "Breakfast is at dawn," he said, his voice still gruff. He glanced at the spotless stove, the organized pantry. "Don't be late." It was the closest thing to a compliment he could manage, but for Wei, it felt like a reprieve. The day settled into a rhythm. Wei rose before the sun, her small lamp a lone point of light in the sleeping ranch. The smell of coffee and frying bacon would rouse the hands. She learned their habits. Jed liked his eggs runny, Pete took 3 spoonfuls of sugar in his coffee, and Silas ate standing up, his mind already on the day's work. Her cooking became the one point of certainty and comfort in their hard lives. They stopped seeing a fragile Chinese girl and started seeing the architect of their one daily pleasure. The distance remained, a wall of culture and experience, but it was no longer hostile. It was respectful. The real test came on Saturday. Silas hitched the wagon for the trip to Redemption Flats. "I need a list," he said, standing at the cookhouse door. "It is better if I come with you," Wei replied, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. "I need to see what is available. The quality of the flour, the price of dried goods. I can save you money." Silas hesitated. Taking her to town was a statement. It was one thing to hire her out on the isolated ranch, it was another to present her in public. He knew the town, knew its narrow-mindedness. But he also knew she was right. She'd already stretched his supplies further than he thought possible. "Fine," he grunted. "Be ready in 10 minutes." Redemption Flats was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. As Silas pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, conversation on the boardwalk faltered. Eyes turned. Men stopped whittling. Women, clustered near the mercantile, paused their chatter and stared. Wei kept her gaze fixed forward as Silas helped her down from the wagon, her face a calm, neutral mask. The bell above the door of Finch's Mercantile announced their arrival. The store was dim and smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. A large, florid man with a pristine white apron stood behind the counter. This was Barton Finch. He owned the store, the saloon, and held the note on half the ranches in the county, including a small, worrying one on Silas's own property. Finch's smile was wide but didn't reach his eyes. "Silas. Good to see you. Heard you found yourself some new help." His gaze slid over to Wei, lingering with an oily appraisal that made her skin crawl. "Barton," Silas said, his voice flat. "We need supplies." He handed Finch a list. Wei ignored them both. She moved through the store with a quiet efficiency, her eyes scanning the shelves. She picked up a sack of beans, letting the contents run through her fingers before nodding. She opened a barrel of flour, smelled it, and moved on to another. Finch watched her, his smile tightening. "Picky, ain't she?" he said to Silas in a low voice. "You sure you know what you've got there, Blackwood? They can be troublesome." "She can cook," Silas said, his jaw tight. "That's all I need to know." And Wei approached the counter. "The flour in the back barrel is better," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And your price on salt is too high. The freight manifests are public. I know what you paid for it." Finch's jaw dropped. He stared at her, then at Silas, his face turning a shade redder. No one questioned his prices. No one. "Now you listen here," he began, his voice rising. "We'll take 2 sacks of the back flour, the beans, and the coffee," Silas interrupted, his voice like stone. He placed a stack of coins on the counter. "We'll get the salt elsewhere." He knew there was nowhere else to get salt, but that wasn't the point. The point was the challenge. Finch stared at the coins, then at Silas's cold eyes, and seemed to make a calculation. He swept the money off the counter with a flick of his wrist. "Have it your way, Blackwood." But a man's choices have a way of catching up to him out here. The threat was unmistakable. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Silas's hands were tight on the reins. He had defended her, drawn a line in the sand. He wasn't sure why, except that her quiet competence had earned his respect, and Finch's open disdain had angered him. What he didn't know was that Wei's challenge to Finch was not about the price of salt. It was a test. And Finch's reaction had confirmed her deepest fear. He was the same man, with the same greed in his eyes, who had managed the rail spur project that had cost her husband his life. He had not recognized her, but she had recognized him. The man who had destroyed her past was now the master of her present. A week later, the crisis came not from town, but from the land itself. Jed rode in at a full gallop, his face pale with panic. "Boss! It's the cattle! In the north pasture! They're down! A dozen of them, maybe more." Silas and the men rode out to find a scene of pastoral horror. Prime steers lay on their sides, their bodies bloated, their breathing shallow and ragged. A few tried to struggle to their feet, only to collapse again. It was a sickness, swift and devastating. "Poison," Pete breathed, his face grim. "But what?" They searched the pasture, their eyes scanning the ground. Silas knelt by a sick animal, his heart a cold knot in his chest. Losing these steers would ruin him. He was already leveraged to the hilt with Finch. "It is the water," a quiet voice said from behind them. Wei had followed them on a spare mule. She pointed to the edge of a small creek that ran through the pasture. Growing in thick clumps was a plant with broad, waxy leaves and small, deceptively pretty purple flowers. "There. The cattle have been eating it." Silas strode over. "That's just weed. Grows every summer. In my home, we call it the purple sleep," she said. "It sweetens the water. Animals drink and eat, and then their lungs fill with fluid. They drown from the inside." The men looked at her, then at the plants, their faces a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. "Is there a cure?" Silas asked, his voice raw. "There is a chance," Wei said. "But we must be fast." She described another plant, a bitter root that grew on rocky, sun-baked slopes. "It counteracts the poison. We need to boil it, make a drench. And we must move the healthy cattle out of this pasture now." Silas didn't hesitate. The local vet was a day's ride away, these cattle would be dead by then. He was a man who trusted what he could see, and he could see the certainty in her eyes. "Jed, Pete! Get the rest of the herd moving. The rest of you, with me. She'll show us what this route looks like." For the rest of the day, the ranch became a frantic hospital. The men rode out in teams, returning with saddlebags full of the dusty root. Wei directed a massive operation in the cook house, boiling the roots in huge cauldrons until the water was a thick, dark, bitter tea. They forced the drench down the throats of the sick animals, a messy, exhausting struggle. Wei worked alongside them, her small frame belying a tireless strength. She showed them how to hold the animals' heads, how to administer the drench without choking them. She was no longer just the cook. She was a commander in a desperate battle. By nightfall, they were done. They had treated 15 steers. Now, all they could do was wait. The men were too exhausted to eat. They sat on the corral fence, staring at the sick pen, a grim silence hanging over them. Silas found Anway by the cook house, washing the last of the huge pots. Her arms were trembling with fatigue. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. She simply nodded, her eyes on her work. "Where did you learn all that?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She paused, her hand still in the water. "My husband. He was a healer. He taught me about the plants." "He was a good man, then," Silas said. "He was," she said, and a shadow of deep pain crossed her face. "He died building the railroad." Before Silas could say more, she turned back to her work, the conversation clearly over. He stood there for a moment, watching her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He had hired a cook. But he had found something else entirely. He walked over to the corral, the weight of the day pressing down on him. What he found in the barn later that night would change everything. Tucked into a corner of her small cabin, which he'd checked to make sure her lamp hadn't been left burning, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. He knew he shouldn't, but a force he didn't understand made him open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, were not letters or trinkets, but official-looking survey maps and a ledger written in a neat, precise hand. He recognized the area on the maps. It was his land. But the lines were wrong. And at the bottom of one page was a signature he knew all too well, Barton Finch. The next morning, 2 of the steers were dead. But 13 were on their feet. They were weak, but they were alive. A ragged cheer went up from the men. Anway's remedy had worked. She had saved the herd. She had saved the ranch. That evening, a quiet descended. The men, their relief palpable, treated Anway with a new kind of reverence. After the meal, Silas waited until everyone had left the cook house. He held the small wooden box in his hands. "I need to ask you about this," he said, placing it on the clean wooden table between them. Anway's face went pale. She stared at the box as if it were a ghost. "You had no right." "No," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't. But I saw the maps. I saw Finch's name. I need you to tell me what this is." She sank onto the bench, her shoulders slumping. She looked at his face, at the genuine confusion and concern in his stormy eyes, and made a decision. The secret was too heavy to carry alone. "My husband, Jen, was not just a laborer on the railroad," she began, her voice soft. "He was an engineer. Self-taught, but brilliant. He was hired to help survey the spur line through these mountains. Finch's company won the contract." She explained how Finch, to save money, had ordered the crews to cut corners, to use less timber for supports in the tunnels, to blast through unstable rock. Jen had protested, showing them his calculations, proving the danger. He kept meticulous records, copies of the real survey maps, and a ledger detailing every shortcut, every substitution. Finch called him into his office, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. He offered him money to be quiet. When Jen refused, Finch fired him. The next day, there was a tunnel collapse. The one Jen had warned them about. They called it an accident. They said he was just a laborer who was in the wrong place. They gave me $50 and told me to be grateful. Silas listened, a cold fury building in his chest. It all made sense now, Finch's immediate dislike of her, his veiled threats. "I took his records," Anway whispered, touching the box. "It was all I had left of him. I came here because I heard it was a quiet place. I didn't know he was here. I didn't know his empire extended this far. When I saw him in the store, I knew I was trapped." Silas looked from her face to the box. This small, quiet woman was sitting on evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in the county. But that evidence had also put her in terrible danger. "He knows," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. Your questions about the freight costs, saving the herd, you're not invisible. He's starting to see you as a threat, not just an inconvenience. As if on cue, the sound of a horse arriving late at night cut through the silence. It was Pete, who'd ridden to the edge of town to check on a stray. His face was grim. "Boss, there's a man at the saloon. A.U.S. Marshal. He's asking questions. About you. About the ranch." Pete paused. "And about her." The threat was no longer financial or social. It had become legal. Finch was making his move, and he was using the law itself as his weapon. 3 months passed. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The 13 steers and whey had saved were now fat and healthy, a testament to her knowledge. The ranch, once on the brink of failure, was humming with a new energy. And Way's careful management had cut their expenses in half, and her skill in preserving the summer garden's bounty meant they would eat well through the winter. She was no longer just the cook, she was Silas's partner in everything but name. The wall between them had crumbled, replaced by a deep, unspoken trust. He had taught her to ride properly, and she had taught him the names of the stars. But the shadow of Barton Finch loomed. He had cut off Silas's credit, forcing them to trade with ranchers further south for what they couldn't make themselves. It was an inconvenience, but they had survived it. Now, Finch was ready for his final move. He arrived one morning not with threats, but with the full force of the law. He rode in a polished buggy, and beside him on a fine horse was the U.S. Marshal, a stern-faced man named Davies. "Blackwood," Finch said, stepping down from his buggy with a triumphant smile. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news." He produced a document with an official seal. "This is a revised territorial deed. It seems the original survey for the railroad grant was in error. This spring," he said, gesturing to the creek that was the lifeblood of the ranch, and the 50 acres surrounding it, belonged to the Wyoming Central Railroad, of which I am the majority owner. It was a death sentence. Without that spring, the ranch would wither and die." Marshal Davies looked uncomfortable. "The deed appears legal, Blackwood. Signed and sealed in Cheyenne. I have a warrant to enforce it." Silas stood on his porch, his face like granite. The ranch hands gathered behind him, their hands clenched. But Silas wasn't looking at Finch. He was looking at Wei, who stood just inside the doorway. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Marshal," Silas said, his voice calm. "Before you enforce that warrant, you might want to see this." He stepped back inside and returned with Jen's wooden box. He opened it on the porch railing for the marshal to see. "These are the original survey maps for that rail spur. And this," he said, opening the ledger, "is a record kept by the engineer who drew them. An engineer who was silenced because he wouldn't approve the fraudulent changes your friend Mr. Finch submitted to the territory." Finch's face went white. "That's preposterous. Lies from some dead laborer." His name was Jen, Wei said, stepping out onto the porch. She looked directly at the marshal, her voice clear and strong. "He was my husband. And he was a better man than Barton Finch could ever hope to be. The ledger details every bribe, every substitution of cheap materials, and the true reason for the tunnel collapse that killed 6 men. A collapse Mr. Finch listed as an act of God." Marshal Davies was no fool. He was a career lawman who knew the smell of corruption. He picked up the ledger, his eyes scanning the neat columns, the dates, the names. He compared the maps in the box to the one Finch had presented. The discrepancies were blatant, the fraud undeniable. He looked up, his eyes cold steel. He looked at Finch, then at Wei's unwavering gaze, and finally at Silas's quiet strength. "Finch," the marshal said, his voice dangerously low. "It seems you and I have a long ride back to Cheyenne ahead of us. There are some questions the territorial judge is going to want answered." Barton Finch sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. But the fight had gone out of him. He was ruined. As the marshal led him away, a broken and defeated man, a quiet cheer went up from the ranch hands. That evening, As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Silas and Wei stood on the porch. The air was clean and cool. The ranch was safe. It was theirs. Silas held a piece of paper in his hand. It was a new deed, drawn up by a lawyer in a neighboring town. It registered a one-half ownership of the Blackwood Ranch to Wei, a widow, in accordance with territorial law. He held it out to her. She looked at the paper, then up at him. His stormy eyes were no longer filled with worry, but with a deep, quiet warmth she had come to know better than her own heartbeat. She didn't take the paper. Instead, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. "We are partners, Silas," she said softly. "I do not need a paper to tell me that." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. He had hired a cook to save his ranch. But she had done more. She had saved him. In the fading light, he covered her hand with his own. The touch was a promise, a beginning. The land was quiet, the work was hard, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, neither of them had to face it alone.